Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello, and welcome to the very first Human Risk podcast. I'm Christian, and in this brand new series we'll be exploring a topic we're all familiar with, people and the way they take decisions. Now, people are often described as the biggest asset of most organisations, but at the same time they're also the largest single source of risk. You don't have to look too hard to find examples where humans have made poor decisions with major consequences. I call this human risk. In simple terms, the risk of people doing something they shouldn't or not doing something they should. As we'll explore, a decision not to do something can be just as dangerous as a decision to do something. I help organisations to think about better ways that they can influence their people's decision making to minimise this risk. I do this by deploying behavioural science, the study of how people actually make decisions. By understanding it, we can manage human risk using the kinds of techniques so effectively deployed by advertisers and social media companies. Human risk is obviously relevant to people working in risk and compliance who need to influence the behaviours of a target audience. But it's also relevant to anyone who has to manage people, whether at work or in a social context. And yes, that absolutely includes those of you with children. Every single one of us is in the business of trying to influence other people with every email we send and conversation we have. In this series of podcasts, I'll be exploring human risk with the help of behavioural science practitioners, people who've experienced human risk at first hand, leading researchers and innovative thinkers. And they don't get much more leading and innovative than my very first guest. I am absolutely thrilled to be launching the podcast with someone whose research and writing has inspired and helped me to think differently about the topic of human risk. Yuval Feldman is a professor of law at Bar Ilan University in Israel. You're probably wondering why I'm so excited about having a lawyer as a guest. Well, as you'll hear, Yuval is no ordinary lawyer. He specialises in a field called behavioural law. During our conversation, we explore what that means, how he came to the subject, and we look at some of the key ideas he explores in his highly recommended book, The Law of Good People. Not only does Yuval have some fascinating insights for how organisations can better think about human risk, he also shares some lovely stories about how he deploys his specialism in the most important unit of all, his family. So to begin our exploration of human risk and kick off this series, I am absolutely delighted to be able to share the conversation with you that I had with Professor Yuval Feldman. So I guess to start with, you specialise in behavioural law. Can you just explain what that involves?
Yes. So my line of research tries to combine psychology and economics and to use those insights into understanding how people make decisions and what can the law do to influence those decisions in ways which are desirable for states and for organizations. The idea is to combine the classical approach of law, which was mostly understanding case law and regulation and laws, to understand how people actually behave, recognizing that there are limits to what the law can do, and therefore understanding how people make decisions, what influence them, how they behave, what makes them consistent, what makes them pro-social, and so forth, are things that we need to understand first before recommending to the legal system how to actually try and change people's behavior.
And this idea of kind of looking at people, how people actually behave rather than the way we would theoretically like them. I mean, that's quite revolutionary in all aspects of life, but particularly I think in law, which looks at sort of codification. How did you start to become interested in this topic?
So I guess like many good things, it happened in a sense by accident. When I went to do my undergrad degrees, I wasn't sure if I want to be a psychologist or a lawyer, so I kind of studied both. And through the studies, I kind of came to realize that there's so many kind of interaction between those disciplines, and I kind of started to explore further. And I recognize that actually there is a rich interaction between psychology and law, but it's mostly around court behavior. So like witnesses, jury decision-making, children testimony, criminals, but there was nothing about lay people. It was as if we are interested in understanding the psychology of very kind of designated groups with the majority of the population and their decision how to, I don't know, to form contracts or how people discriminate or how people behave in conflict of interest. I recognized that in those areas there was basically no interaction between law and psychology. And then I wanted to do a PhD. There was no one in the field in Israel, so I went to UC Berkeley in California, where I actually found kind of a really nice program they have over there for a social science analysis of law. And I had in my committee Robert Kutter, who is a prominent economist, and then two psychologists, Phil Tetlock and Rob McCune. Interestingly enough, none of my PhD advisors has any legal education. So I was doing like a PhD in law, doing all the coursework in law, but with advisors which were actually psychologists and economists. And I think this had a lot of influence in how I view the law today. Even I'm kind of a law professor, but I was trained as a kind of a social scientist. And I think I see now more and more people who are social scientists working in law schools, and I think it's an important addition to the legal scholarship.
That's very interesting. I mean, I see lots of parallels with people taking economics, sort of very theoretical field, and doing the same thing. And I think what you're doing for the legal sphere is sort of similar to what's happened with economics. So it's very interesting to hear how you, along with many other people, accidentally fell into the sort of behavioral aspects of a sort of more established discipline. I'd love to move on and talk about your book, which you recently published, The Law of Good People. And it wasn't, I have to admit, something I would naturally read with a title like that. But I heard so much about what you've done that I was fascinated. How do you describe what's in the book, sort of in one or two sentences?
Yes, so thank you. In two sentences, I guess the first one was the attempt to introduce behavioral ethics, which is a growing field. In a sense, it's we know a lot about behavioral economics, about heuristics and biases, and how people are not rational. And behavioral ethics, in a sense, try to employ kind of similar perspective, but not so much with regard to rationality, but with regard to people's ethics. And kind of the general idea is that understanding how people make ethical decision making, we need to recognize all the mechanisms through which people either ignore, justify, deceive themselves about the full legal and moral meaning of what they do. And the argument of the book is that by understanding those mechanisms, there's so many different things that the state should do if you want to regulate the behavior in many important aspects, such as conflict of interest and discrimination and behavior and organization and corporate law and so forth and so on. So I think it's kind of try to open a discussion about how this new field should shape our understanding of what the law can do, and what it can't do, and what you need to understand about people's ethical decision making.
And the title of the book, I mean, you reference good people, and therefore by implication, there's a challenge around regulating for bad people. Could you just explain a little bit more around that?
Sure. So in a sense, when I say the good people, I'm focusing on the wrongdoing of good people. So it's kind of this challenge caused by people who feel that they are good, which makes many of the traditional mechanisms used by the state to be less effective. So when focusing on bad people, I mean, it's this assumption that people are very calculative, they behave badly because the price seems not too high for them, and therefore they suggest, okay, the benefit of wrongdoing is so high, I should behave badly. And therefore sanctions and fines are supposed to make the price of non-cooperative behavior or illegal behavior to be too high. And the problem with those assumptions is that, as I describe it, it's just unrealistic, and a lot of experiments suggest how unrealistic it is. Obviously, sanctions have an effect on people, but in many contexts, people do not know that what they do is illegal or immoral, or at least not in an objective way or not in the accurate way. And therefore, just telling me, for example, that discrimination will be penalized with huge fines will not affect those employers who do not think that what they do is to discriminate. So you need to first be aware of what is it that you do for the fines to have an effect on you.
And that sort of takes me on nicely to a concept that I found absolutely fascinating in your book, which is this idea of quality of compliance. And it's I think it's kind of obvious, and yet when I read about it, it really sort of opened my mind. Can you just explain what you mean by quality of compliance and why it's important?
Yes. So again, and this is something which is important for me to emphasize. I'm not against sanctions or penalties or fines. I mean, at the end of the day, if you have only one mechanism you can use, this is actually could be your safest bet. Because in terms of proportion of people who will react to fines, are probably going to be a large proportion of the population going to react to fines. The problem starts when you are interested in type of behaviors where just complying is not enough. And this starts the whole discussion about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So in many contexts, and especially in organizations, when we want people to behave in a certain way, it's not just that we want them to have some kind of checklist and then they do everything. We want them to behave in a way which will be good for the organization or for the public, or depending on the institution. And there are limits to measurement. So if you use incentives, you have to assume you can measure everything. And this is, again, unrealistic. You can't measure all types of behavior. And therefore, once you focus only on kind of monetary incentives, you might get some sort of a shallow compliance. You can't measure all of their behaviors, and in many ways you might harm the quality of compliance. So people will do what you measure, but they will not do what you don't measure. There are in many ways not going to get you the effective results you're interested in. And kind of I suggest in the book some sort of a taxonomy on the areas in which we care more about proportion of compliance versus quality of compliance versus how much are we afraid of those people who will not comply. And if we have time, I could discuss some more of kind of the differences areas of law where this kind of different trade-off make more sense.
What I read there, I think, really resonated with me. I think a favorite example of mine is employee surveys, where many organizations have this obsession with getting 100% of people to fill it in. And it occurred to me on reading your book that if you force people to fill in a survey, the likelihood of them filling it in diligently or not reacting to that pressure is pretty limited. And therefore, what you're doing if you force people to fill in an employee survey is taking high quality data of I want to fill in your survey and commingling it with very low quality data of I have filled your survey in under duress. And therefore, the objective of getting that higher percentage actually undermines something, the way you have the high quality data that says there's a reason I don't want to fill in your survey. And you might not know what that is, but you need to find it out. And I thought it was very fascinating seeing this drive for we need 100% actually destroys the quality of both the data of the people that don't want to fill it in and the quality of the data of the people that do.
Exactly.
And one of the other things I thought was interesting was in terms of how you sort of look at things like legitimacy and moral content of laws, and you're challenging the implicit presumption that whoever is legislating has the right to legislate in that sphere, and I think it's interesting in a societal perspective, but it's also obviously very interesting from an employee perspective. Could you talk a little bit around sort of legitimacy and how that works and how you think about that?
Yes. So I think something like 1990, it was a very influential book by Tom Tyler, which called Why People Obey the Law. And he was one of the first, if not one of the first scholars to focus on kind of legitimacy as affecting people's motivation to obey laws or employment rules and so forth and so on. And he did a lot of study and many others suggesting that things like voice and neutrality of the employer or of the regulator affect the likelihood that people will obey those rules. And in the book, I recognize that, and I've done some studies along this tradition, but I would also like to challenge some of the assumption of this literature by suggesting that in many ways, people don't always stop to think, is that rule legitimate or not, or should I trust this authority or not? Many of the decisions we make are so fast that it's not clear what is the role of legitimacy um, and morality. And the second point that I make in the book is to recognize the problem in fairness and morality in a sense that sometimes your self-interest will affect what you think is moral. Again, many paradigms along those lines, motivated reasoning and self-perception of fairness, egocentric fairness, suggest that morality is really malleable. So if I do something, I'm more likely to think it's moral to do it, suggesting that it's not always the case that morality and fairness will prevent us from doing what we want, because we have those mechanisms that allow us to change what we think is moral and what is fair. And this is kind of a limit of this kind of literature. I think it's important to account for legitimacy and morality, but we also need to understand it's not the perfect solutions for people non-compliance.
And as you're talking, I can think of lots of examples of authorities that don't think in those terms. Have you seen anyone that does? Are there any laws or regulations that you think really capture the spirit of what you're suggesting?
One example that I have in mind, and I think there is a lot of progress in this area, is related to conflict of interest. And I had myself kind of work with the Israeli government on trying to improve the dealing of conflict of interest. And there, for example, you see this recognition of the preventive mode. So recognizing that it's not enough to wait until someone is kind of doing something really terrible and then we prosecute him with all the problems of criminal law. We try to create situation where ex ante, so before something happens, the situation is designed in such way which will make it hard for people to engage in any kind of behavior in which conflict of interest exists. You see this also in the around the world in regulation of doctors, where there is this recognition that their ties with the pharma industry might cloud their judgment. So you don't wait until the doctor do something bad and then prosecute him. I mean, this happens too. But more importantly, they create various regulations which tries to control those ties. And I think there is an increasing recognition that you don't need to have a lot of ties between, say, a doctor and a pharma industry or a politician and a constructor for those ties to affect the objectivity of the decision maker. And I think this is actually evolving as the science in this area would suggest.
And I think it's very interesting when you talk in those terms, because it sounds very simple, and yet many legislators don't seem to grasp that principle. They come from the theoretical. And what you seem to be saying is, look, what we need to do is accept that people will do these things. There is a likelihood of people doing these things. Mm-hmm. And therefore we need to build an environment that responds to that, not by having punitive elements at the end, but not just by having punitive elements, but also by accepting that as you build the structure. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, I think, again, I can't say, all the regulators all around the world are behave in a similar way, but I definitely see in recent years a growing interest in behavioral sciences and a willingness to heed to the advice of researchers working in this area. And I can give, if I have time, I can give an example. A study I did with a colleague from the Hebrew University, Eyal Pe'er. We were trying to examine the efficacy of using honesty pledges. So again, around the world, and there is an OECD recommendation, and the World Bank has dealt with this issue of reducing regulatory burden and how it helped businesses thrive. And one of the difficulties government face when they try to make it easy for business owners, let's say, to get licenses for the businesses, is the lack of trust. So the regulators, they need to protect the public. They need to do their job. And so they ask everyone, let's say he want to have a new business, he needs to bring a lot of evidence and a lot of documentation. And this takes time and make it really problematic for small businesses to thrive. And there are now initiatives in many countries, including in Israel, that try to think how can we make it easier for people who want to be honest, they want to cooperate. How can we know in advance if I'm dealing with an honest person, and to what extent can we actually trust them? And we actually created a series of experiments in which we demonstrated the context in which honesty pledges, which are done prior to the task, improve in combination with fines, improve the likelihood that what people say in their affidavits, in their statements, are going to be accurate. And we also show what are the people who are more positively reacting to those pledges. And I think this is a promising directions, and if with more research will help government trust people and reduce the need to bring evidence for every claim or every factual claim they make as they try to open a business or to obtain a license to engage in various activities.
That's very, very interesting, and certainly resonates with me as a former regulator. It's very easy when you're on that side of the fence to operate on the side of caution, because you never want to be the person that permitted something that shouldn't have happened. On the other hand, the safest approach for regulators is to permit nothing. And therefore, right. I think what you've described there is a nice way of sort of thinking intelligently about solving a big challenge, which is that clearly there are activities that need to be undertaken, but they come with a degree of risk for society. If I sort of shift away from legislation and take you away from law and perhaps more into the field of kind of compliance and risk, if we looked at that, what advice would you give people who were trying to build their own control environment? In other words, legislating for an environment they have responsibility for. Can they just apply the findings that you've come up with for sort of nations and larger bodies to their own environment, or are there differences in terms of larger and smaller environments?
Yes, so of course there are differences, and I think if anything, organizations have more leverage than states in what they can do. So, because of kind of we have this fear against government reaching too much, there is a limit of how far we would like regulators and state entities to get into people's life. But organizations, in a sense, since they have this interaction with their employees, in many ways through the whole day, through a longer period of time, I think the kind of tools that organization can use is more diverse and actually more likely to be able to use kind of smarter techniques of regulations, which for various reasons are prohibited for states. And if I will focus on kind of organizations, I would say, and this is something I say to states, but I think it could be adopted to organization, is this notion of focusing on the small things. And I think both regulators and in many contexts kind of business leader have this tendency to look for smoking guns. So again, in the spirit of legitimacy, if you go after someone for doing something really bad, you're more likely to enjoy legitimacy, because you can say, this guy is really a problematic guy, and therefore he should be fired, he should be penalized, and so far. But I think some of the findings of behavioral ethics suggest that the smaller things, those which are hard to get into the traditional legal means, in the end are more likely to have an effect. Let me give you an example from the context of discrimination. So we can say we focus only on discrimination in how people are being fired or kind of passed for promotion. But people who study discrimination would say that discrimination happens on a daily basis. It happens in kind of these non-deliberate decisions employer will have when he decides who will I take with me to this important meeting with the client. And those kind of decisions are usually non-regulated. No one could sue for discrimination saying they didn't take me to this meeting with these important clients, and the kind of aggregation of those dozens of decisions throughout the year had affected my likelihood of staying or to stay working with this employer. And so focusing on those kind of daily decisions is, I think, the most important lesson from the book and from in general from behavioral ethics, because those are the type of decisions which will affect the larger or more important outcomes. And then if we wait, we don't focus on the situation, we don't focus on trying to improve the impartiality and the implicit discrimination that sometimes happen on daily decisions, and we wait until someone is get fired and only regulate that situation, we're going to miss most of the important factors that determine who is being discriminated. And I can go through various other examples in the workplace using the same way to show how this kind of focus on the more kind of benign, the more daily routine type of decisions, which literature suggests is more likely to happen without too much reflection, how those types of decisions are the one we should focus on.
I think that's really interesting because in my experience, there's a lot of focus on set pieces like promotions or hiring, where you have a formalized process and it's easy to build things around that process. But as you say, the reality of life is that lots of small things can add up, and actually those big processes tend to come at the end of other things having happened. And I guess there's two sort of thoughts I had as you were talking. The first one was, does moral legitimacy increase if you are seen to be more responsive and engaging with your audience? In other words, if you show that you think about these topics, is there an increase in sort of the legitimacy of the legislator?
So I can think of kind of conflicting prediction. One would suggest yes. I mean, just the fact that you try and kind of understand in a more nuanced way how people make decisions makes you seen as not kind of detached from reality. You actually understanding people's reality and try to work with it rather than come up with kind of one policy fits all broad policies which people feel are not reflecting their daily life. On the other hand, I think there is this risk and this kind of discussions that around nudges and around this whole focus on people non-deliberative choice or people implicit processes. In a sense, you kind of harm their agency model. So you suggest that it's not always the case that people make sound decisions and people that know exactly what they do. You kind of uncover various mechanisms which cause people to feel that you don't see them as a whole person, right? You kind of focus on various processes in their decision making, suggesting that this small change in the situation will cause them to do that, or to comply, not to comply, to cheat, or to be pro-social. So this kind of approach, sometimes I notice people are resenting to this kind of view of them, not as kind of an agent who know exactly what they do and why they do it, but they're more kind of a person who reacts to changes in the circumstances in this situation, even if he's not fully aware of those changes. So that you have kind of those conflicting views about how this line of way of looking at people affect their perception of legitimacy.
And that sort of brings me on to the second point. Thank you for that. Which is around. I mean, a lot of the reason organizations introduce requirements is because they want to be seen to be introducing them. So you have a regulator, or there is a legal risk if you didn't point something out. The sort of logic that leads you to having cups of coffee with warnings on them that the cup of coffee might contain a warm liquid. So kind of statements the obvious. So in other words, a primacy of auditability over practicality. How do you see organizations' ability to kind of overcome this need to demonstrate that they are managing risk, but at the same time, in doing so, often that leads you to sort of making statements the obvious or putting in place regulation that might induce some of the things you've just mentioned?
It's an interesting question. My kind of hunch reaction might be to show the employees that you're actually checking yourself. And there's a whole discussion about evidence-based this policy making. You see that in public policy, you see it in medicine. In many areas now, there is this recognition that to create good policies, you have to base them on evidence. And I think that if employees or member of an organization will notice that the employer or whoever are the leaders of that organization actually measure the efficacy of what they implement, would suggest that they take seriously what they do. And I think if you just put all kind of regulation in place and all kind of requirements, and it seems that you don't even care if they work or not, then people might view you in a cynical way, and they're less likely to comply because they feel you only say that not because you think it's working, but as you suggested in your question, because there is this regulation that suggests we have this code of business. You don't really care if it's this code of ethics. You don't really care if it's affecting us. But I think other than the obvious value of collecting data and understanding how or the importance of measuring what's working and what's not working, I think has an importance also for perception of the employees. I mean, if they see that you take what you do seriously and you actually try to improve, and if something is not working, you will revise it. I think this creates an important lesson for employees of how serious the employer takes the requirements he or she puts in place.
And final question from me, and we've talked about sort of going from the States to smaller organizations. Let's move down to an even smaller organization, the family unit. And I know you've got a family. How are you and your wife applying your research when you set rules in your domestic life?
So I have one anecdote, and then I give 2 points. One. So my wife is also a professor. She's an algorithmic game theory perspective. In a sense, she has the opposite view of people. So very rational, because game theory have to assume people are very rational and kind of only react to information and incentives, which by the way doesn't make any of us a better decision maker. We just kind of know about the mistakes others do and how they make decisions. But the kind of, being a household with 2 professors, we actually put a lot of emphasis not to create any kind of, we had this fear that the kids will be maybe, too ambitious, having 2 parents as professors. And I repeatedly, and I really believe it, every time they show me a grade of an exam, I tell them, this is nice, but it's not the important. The important thing is to be a good people. And this has been going on for years. And then, recently with the book, The Law of Good People, at some point, the kids actually recognize that what I mean in the book, in good people, is actually a bad word in a sense. So it's actually not really good people, but it's the people who self-perceive themselves as good people and therefore are unwilling or unable to understand that when they behave badly, this is something which is should be changed. It's something that the law should care about, and this creates some crisis of trust where they say, oh, but good people we thought was a different thing. So this is an anecdote about the family. But I think as you're also presented it in your question. So this move from state to organizations, which I said, have this greater ability to use more less traditional tools. In a sense, I think from organization to family, it's even more, right? So you have more legitimacy to affect not just kind of bottom lines or measuring performance, but to focus on things like values and things which sometimes, if the state would try to make people better people by focusing on their values, many people would say this is not something that the state should do. The state should only focus on bottom lines. And I don't know if you know him, the former chief rabbi of the UK, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. I don't know.
Yes, yeah.
So I think he's increasingly famous beyond kind of the Jewish minority of the UK. And he has in his books, he talks a lot about kind of he doesn't use the rhetoric of system 1 and system 2 decision making, kind of the thinking fast and slow of Danny Kahneman. But he kind of focused on kind of the science and the rational side and the more kind of experiential side. So when you try to change people's behavior, it's not just by talking to their kind of rational part, this is the right thing to do, but it's also through experience, through rituals, through repetitions. And I think this is something that, again, in organization, but definitely in families, it's the kind of tools that I wish state could use too. So in a sense, if we want to make people more cooperative in state level, I wish we could speak not just about bottom line, but also kind of to have people, reflect repeatedly about what they do. We sometimes do it, for example, in kind of in traffic context. So when you try to educate drivers, you see this notion of repetition and rituals and reminding people all the time about what's the right thing to do. Somehow, I think probably for safety reasons, there is more legitimacy of the state to do it in that context. There is reduced legitimacy to do it in, taxation or other areas where it's mostly usually about kind of bottom line. We don't try to educate you, and I think there are many interesting parallels to be drawn from comparing kind of those three levels, the state, the organization, and the family, and to question whether we want to use kind of things which work on a family level, whether it will be legitimate for the state to employ it. I think it's an important question.
That was a fascinating answer, and I'm very intrigued by the family dynamics there. That was a lovely depiction, yeah. And what a wonderful note to end this interview on. Thank you so much for sparing the time. Your book is now out, having been out in hardback last year, is now out in paperback. So there is no excuse for anyone not to pick it up. So we will post the notes to that alongside the podcast details so everybody can access it. Thoroughly recommended read and a fascinating, wonderful conversation. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you for all those intelligent questions, which forced me to think hard about the book and about what is it that I do.
Oh, always a pleasure. It's nice to have an academic as well that really is doing something that I think is obviously phenomenally useful and groundbreaking. So it's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much.
So there we have it. First podcast done. Thanks to Yuval for his time and to you for listening. That is the end of our first episode. For details of Yuval's book and some of the other key points that we covered in the discussion, please have a look at the show notes. And if you're not already receiving my Human Risk newsletter, then you can subscribe for that at www.human-risk.com. You can also follow at Human Risk Blog on Twitter for more human risk related content, and feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Get in touch, let me know what you thought of the first episode, and do make sure that you subscribe if you want further episodes, and you'll get them as soon as they're released. The podcast is available on iTunes, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you back on another episode very, very soon.